February 1972, Oslo, 9 degrees below zero. 48,000 people had packed into that stadium. Not for a game, not for a race. They had come to watch their country's strongest man do what he always did, win .31 competitions. 31 first-place finishes, not once defeated. Not even close. Standing across from him that day would be a 143-pound Chinese man, quiet, ordinary-looking. The kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. The crowd laughed when they saw him. The reporters had already placed their bets. The outcome felt so obvious that nobody even stopped to wonder how it might go. This wasn't a competition in their minds. It was a formality. The kind where the big man swallows the little man whole and the crowd goes home satisfied. But that freezing afternoon, something happened that nobody in that stadium was prepared for. A moment came where 48,000 people went completely still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because what they were watching had never been seen in any stadium anywhere in the world. And every single person who was there that day would still be telling that story years later, quietly, carefully, like it was something they still hadn't fully made sense of. But before we get there, if you're already leaning forward wondering where this is headed, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit like on this video. Because what's coming in the next few minutes is one of the most remarkable stories we've ever told here. And if you're ready, let's go back to that day. Erik Halvorsen had never lost. And when we say that, we're not talking about a lucky streak or a handful of local wins. We're talking about a man who had built his entire identity around being unbeatable. Erik was born in a small fishing village on the southern coast of Norway. By the age of 7, he was climbing sea cliffs. By 12, he was pushing through open water swells that most grown men wouldn't attempt. At 16, he entered his first local strength competition. He won. He entered another. He won again. And he never stopped. By the time he was 29, his record stood at 31 competitions, 31 first-place finishes. The national lifting record had been broken 3 times. Each time, it was Erik who had broken it. At the 1971 Viking Strength Championship in Oslo, he carried a 440-pound stone for 47 seconds without setting it down. His competitors dropped to their knees in front of the crowd while Erik just kept walking. Now, on a brutally cold February morning in 1972, he stood before the press inside the marble corridors of the Oslo Viking Museum. Behind him stood a 9th century longship, its ancient wooden skeleton carrying centuries of silence. Erik's chest was bare. The temperature outside read 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Hold on to that detail. Because in this story, the cold isn't just weather. A journalist stepped up to the podium. He was holding a photograph. In it stood a slim, 143-pound Chinese man. Wire-rimmed glasses, plain clothes. He didn't look like a nobody, but he could have passed for one easily enough. "Erik," the journalist said, "what do you think about Bruce Lee?" The room went quiet. The pale winter light filtered in through the high windows. Erik stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he raised his head, and with that expression of his, the one that looked like confidence to most people, but carried, if you looked carefully, the very first crack of arrogance, he spoke, a small actor from a tropical climate. "Someone who has never seen an Oslo winter. In this ring, in this cold, he wouldn't last 10 seconds in front of me." Laughter moved through the room like a wave. Erik continued. "My ancestors were Vikings. The cold is our weapon. Size is real. What this little man does in his films is completely fake. I'm inviting him. If he comes, the audience will find out who he really is." That statement ran on the front page of 8 Norwegian newspapers the following morning. 3 days later, Bruce Lee accepted. The press conference was held in an office on a film set in Tokyo. Bruce had been up since 5 that morning and had already finished 2 hours of training. Reporters crowded in with their questions. "How will you handle temperatures below zero? Erik outweighs you more than 2 to 1. Is this a performance or a real fight?" Bruce looked at them one by one. "The cold," he said, his voice calm and even. "Will be there, I will be there, and that is enough for me." One reporter pushed further. But physically speaking, Bruce cut him off. Physically speaking, a falling stone can be stopped by the wind. What matters is how the stone was released. Nobody in the room fully understood that line. But they would. Erik Halvorsen's story began in 1943, a small town near Bergen, a place that smelled of fish and coal dust, gray and heavy. Before his father disappeared at sea, he had taught Erik exactly one thing. Son, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who see the wave coming, and those who face it head-on. Erik had decided at the earliest possible age to be the second kind. At 13, he started lifting weights. At 15, he was dragging empty sacks out of a storage room, filling them with sand and carrying them on his shoulders for 3 hours a day. By 18, he was lifting things that nobody else in that village could lift. He never went to college. Never felt the need. In his mind, talent wasn't measured on paper. It was measured on granite. And at every measurement, Erik came out on top. The Viking Museum Challenge wasn't spontaneous. It was a calculated move. A carefully chosen stage, part of a broader media campaign. When you've held the top of the strength world for years, sometimes you need to create an opponent. At that point, Bruce Lee was one of the most talked about names coming out of Asia, and the press couldn't get enough of him. Erik's manager had done simple math. Put the little man in front of the big man. Promote it. Sell it. Nobody had stopped to consider that Bruce Lee might be doing his own math inside that same equation. When the challenge was announced, the Norwegian sports community laughed. One of Europe's leading combat sports critics wrote that week, "This event is at its core a disrespectful spectacle. Placing a 143-pound man across from Erik Halvorsen is no different from a circus act." Someone read that article and jotted a small note. It was later discovered that note had been written in Bruce Lee's own personal notebook. A single line, "Size can create the illusion of power. But the real test is something else entirely." Bislett Stadium sat at the heart of Oslo. Capacity, 45,000. That Monday, February 14, 1972, the gates opened at 10 in the morning. By noon, the stadium was full. By 1 o'clock, snow still covered parts of the field, and people were sitting on plastic bags just to keep the cold out. Every breath in that crowd came out as vapor, drifting through the stands like white smoke. 48,000 people. To put that in perspective, that afternoon, the combined attendance of every other event happening anywhere in Norway didn't come close to half that number. At 1:45, Erik Halvorsen emerged from the south tunnel, chest bare. The stands erupted. Erik walked to the ring, gripped the corner post, and waited. Then a 440-pound Viking stone was carried out from the side. Erik lifted it in one clean motion, hoisted it onto his shoulder, and walked a full loop around the ring for 45 seconds. Glass cups trembled in people's hands. The crowd rose to its feet. Every murmur, every lingering doubt, all of it dissolved into something raw and electric, and then silence from the tunnel. Without fanfare, without raising a hand to the crowd, wearing a plain gray long-sleeve top, and walking one steady step at a time, he emerged. Bruce Lee, 48,000. Norwegians froze in the stands. When Bruce gripped the corner rope, the crowd's reaction could be summed up in one word: silence. But not the silence of respect. This was the silence that falls when something feels wrong. A brief, strange stillness that came from one collective question rippling through every section of that stadium. Did the wrong man just walk out? Whispers spread through the rows. Journalists in the front rows glanced at each other. One was scribbling in a notepad, probably something like "underwhelming entrance." Erik Halvorsen stood in his corner directly across the ring, eyes locked on Bruce, and in those eyes, if you were watching carefully, there was only one thing: relief. He had expected at least someone who looked like a challenge. What he saw instead had put him completely at ease. And that ease, quiet, comfortable, certain, was the first step toward the biggest mistake Erik Halvorsen would make that day. Bruce ducked through the ropes and walked to the center of the ring. His feet tested the surface with each step. Not icy, but damp, cold, slick. The sun sat low on the horizon, and the shadow cast by the upper stands covered half the ring in pale gray. Bruce stopped in the dead center of that shadow and looked around him. 48,000 people, you couldn't hear a single breath. He wasn't warming up. No stretching, no neck rolls. He was simply standing there, arms at his sides. His eyes weren't closed, but they were turned inward as if he had quietly set aside the noise of the stadium and was measuring something only he could feel. A Norwegian photographer working at ringside said later, I looked up at the crowd. Tens of thousands of people. And then I looked at Bruce. And in that moment I realized he was the only calm person there. Everyone else was nervous or excited. Only him, he had no nerves at all. The referee called both fighters to the center. Erik walked forward. The ground seemed to groan under him, and that's not a figure of speech, it was real. His rubber-soled shoes pressed into the surface under 265 pounds, each step its own. Quiet declaration. While the referee ran through the rules, Erik never took his eyes off Bruce's. That was Erik's pre-fight ritual. Stare the man down before the bell. It had always worked before, but what was about to happen next, nobody in that stadium was ready for it. The referee finished. Both men stepped back. Erik had worn nothing. Against the cold, that was a deliberate choice. For years he had trained outdoors in Bergen's winters. The cold didn't touch him, or so he believed. His chest was bare, and when the cold air hit his skin, he didn't flinch once. Bruce wore a thin, gray long-sleeve top. Only his hands were exposed, but if you looked carefully, you'd notice something. Bruce's breathing was different. When most people exhaled in that cold, a heavy plume of steam would billow from their mouths. Bruce's breath was barely visible. Slower, deeper, more controlled, as if his body wasn't releasing heat into the air, but holding it inside. This was a technique. In Chinese tradition, it was called Neigong internal energy control, the regulation of body temperature through breath management. Bruce had been working on this since his earliest years in Hong Kong, but he had never needed it more than now. In the stands, people were whispering, "How long will it last? Does he go down on the first hit? Erik wins for sure, but which second does it happen?" And then the bell rang, but before we get into what happens next, if you want to see how this plays out, subscribe to the channel and hit like. There's a lot more where this came from. Erik moved immediately. For a man his size, it was faster than you'd expect. His first step came with a full weight transfer. By the second step, his right fist was already rising, a wide horizontal punch driven from the shoulder. If it landed on the jaw, nobody would be debating which direction the jaw went. But Bruce wasn't there. He had slipped 3 inches to the left. Just 3 inches. The punch passed right by his ear, close enough for the wind of it to brush his skin. Erik had already launched his second motion, left arm this time. Not a punch, but a shove, designed to throw his opponent backward. Against most men, it would have ended things right there, but Bruce wasn't there either. He hadn't just stepped right. He had stepped forward at the same time. One spectator described the moment this way. Erik was punching the wind, and the wind was turning around to look at him. Erik Halvorsen had never missed. And that wasn't just something people said about him. His hands had spent a lifetime learning to find and hold whatever they reached for, hauling fishing nets, gripping rock faces, locking onto an opponent. When those hands closed around something, they stayed closed. There was a story from Erik's training camp back in Bergen from when he was young. His coach had told him to hold onto a post and not let go. He held it for 6 hours. His hands bled. He still didn't let go. But now, inside the frozen air of Bislett Stadium, those hands were grabbing at nothing. The first 2 strikes had missed. This wasn't in Erik's math. Smaller men usually backed up. They went defensive. They got cornered. This small man was stepping forward, not just evading, repositioning. And that repositioning was quietly breaking every assumption. Erik's momentum had been built on. Erik paused for a fraction of a second. The stands noticed. 48,000 people inhaled. At the same moment, then Erik moved again, differently this time. 2 slow steps, then an explosive burst. Left shoulder driving in, right arm following, a wrestler's move. Close the distance, get a grip, Drag the man down, pin him with body. Wait, it had worked for Erik before. He had brought down bigger men with it. Bruce felt the pressure from the left side and shifted, his body at a nearly invisible angle, just enough to redirect Erik's charge away from his own center. As Erik's shoulder drove through empty space, Bruce's right hand made the lightest contact with Erik's wrist and guided it. He didn't block it, he didn't break it. He just redirected it 2 inches, but those 2 inches redirected the entire force. Of 265 pounds in the wrong direction, by the time Erik realized he was pitching forward, he had already taken 1 step too many. Balance recovered, but rhythm broken, and Erik's entire system was built on rhythm. Every strength athlete system is. When the rhythm goes, you need time to reset. You need space to gather yourself. Before the next move, Bruce didn't give him that time. A strike to the right shoulder, short, elbow-driven, almost casual, almost hidden within the movement. Not powerful, not devastating, but exactly placed. It landed on the deltoid of Erik's right shoulder, just above the scapula. For a strength athlete, that spot wasn't just muscle. It was a critical gear in a finely tuned machine. It wasn't pain, exactly. It was a signal. The body's way of saying, pay attention. This is here. Erik stopped. The stands didn't catch the hesitation, but a photographer did. His camera froze that exact moment, and that photo ran in several Norwegian sports papers in the days that followed. The expression on Erik's face was hard to put into words, not shock, not anger. It was the face of a man who has just realized that his math isn't adding up. The cold air was turning both men's breath to steam. But Erik's was heavier now, quicker, shallower. His body was fighting the cold at the same time. It was fighting for oxygen. 2 demands pulling in opposite directions. Muscles tire faster in the cold. Lactic acid builds quicker. 15 years of outdoor training in Bergen had slowed that process, but it couldn't stop it. Bruce, meanwhile, looked like he was resting. His breathing hadn't changed. He was holding the heat his body produced like a blanket wrapped around himself. And, doing it without burning energy, he was conserving it. And that conservation was compounding with every passing second, like interest building quietly in a bank. Something strange was beginning to dawn on the stands. In the first moments, every move had come from Erik, but nobody could land a clean hit on Bruce, and yet Bruce wasn't the one attacking. He was barely moving. The logic of the fight was backward. The bigger man was the one in motion, but every outcome was going exactly where the smaller man seemed to want it. This didn't match how the crowd expected a fight to work. Normally, the bigger man attacks and the smaller man defends or runs. What was happening here was neither. The smaller man wasn't attacking, he wasn't running. He was, with an almost unsettling precision, always in exactly the right place. Journalist wrote in his notebook that day, Bruce Lee is not dancing. But Erik looks like he's following Lee's choreography. Erik pulled in a deep breath. The vapor bloomed white and scattered in the cold air. Then something shifted in his eyes. He was calculating. And the calculation wasn't giving him good news. When Erik was 15 years old, he met an old fisherman on the docks in Bergen. The man was past 80. His hands were knotted like tree roots, but his eyes were still clear. That day, as Erik was strutting down the waterfront, the old man stopped. Son, he had said, there are 2 kinds of strength. The first is believing nothing can stop you. The second is knowing what can. Erik hadn't listened. He was young, strong, and impatient. Old men's words had seemed abstract and pointless back then. But now, inside the freezing air of Bislett Stadium, that sentence had come back like a ghost, because Erik was about to find out what could stop him. And it wasn't the man across the ring's fist. It was the cold, large muscles require strong blood flow. Strong blood flow produces heat through exertion. But if that heat is spent too fast or stolen by cold air, the muscles begin to cool. A cooled muscle contracts slower, generates less force. And Erik was right in the middle of that process. Every missed strike hadn't just been a physical waste. It meant his muscles had fired at maximum load and come up empty. He was burning fuel and bleeding body heat at the same time. cooling down and wearing out simultaneously. Two processes accelerating each other. Bruce was experiencing the exact opposite that morning. Before stepping into the stadium, Bruce had spent 2 hours alone in a hotel room. To any outside observer, it would have looked like he was simply sitting, but it wasn't sitting, it was breath work. With each cycle, he was preparing his body, not just mentally but physically. Certain breathing techniques, researchers would later confirm, can raise core body temperature by 2 to 3 degrees. Bruce hadn't learned this from the textbook. He had learned it from years of practice. And now, in temperatures well below freezing, that practice was quietly paying off. In the ring. Yes, Bruce's breath was visible, steaming in the cold air like everyone else's. But the rhythm hadn't changed. Erik's, meanwhile, was getting shallower. Even from the front rows, you could see the difference. Erik went again. He started with the left arm, but didn't follow with the right. A feint, draw the smaller man. The wrong direction, then catch him with the real strike. This had worked for Erik before. Opponents would react to the first movement and leave themselves wide open for what came next. Bruce didn't react. Erik hadn't expected that. There were only two reasons not to react to a feint. Either you didn't see it, or you saw it and chose not to take the bait. The first was impossible. Bruce's eyes were locked on him. So it had to be the second. Bruce had read it as a fake. That told Erik something. The man across from him wasn't just reacting, he was reading him. Reading the slight variations in muscle tension, the direction of a weight shift, the angle of a shoulder joint. Before the movement was even complete, Erik spent 1 second absorbing that reality, and in that 1 second, Bruce moved forward just 1 step, left and diagonal. That step opened up Erik's right side, his dominant side, his powerful side, but also the side that left him most exposed when he was fully committed. Bruce's right hand came down on Erik's right shoulder again. Same spot, same light, precise touch, but deeper this time. And Erik involuntarily had to take 1 step left, just to stay on his feet. Something happened in the stadium at that moment. A handful of people in the front rows stood up. They couldn't explain what they were feeling, but they could feel that something had shifted. Something was wrong. Something was off. The sound of the crowd had changed. At the start, it had been loud, festive, certain. A crowd that knew Erik, loved Erik, had already handed Erik the win before the bell even rang. But now the sound was different, quieter, and drifting through that quiet was a different kind of question. What is this small man doing? At the 7-second mark of the fight, Erik Halvorsen hesitated for the first time. Very few people caught it. From the stands, everything still looked like the big man was in control. Erik was moving, attacking, taking up space. But a few experienced eyes at ringside had seen something different. Erik's first 3 strikes had come with his shoulders pitched forward, full body weight behind them. Now his shoulders were slightly more upright, his steps slightly more cautious. And that small difference pointed toward something much larger. Erik had started thinking. In a fight, thinking can be a sign of awareness. But for Erik Halvorsen, thinking was a warning signal. His entire system had been built on moving without thinking. Years of training had hammered that in. No analysis, only execution. And that system had given him 31 wins, but now the system was giving him feedback it had never given before. Every strike going wide, every charge finding nothing, every feint getting read. And that unbroken string of failure had slowly started a question forming in Erik's mind. Why isn't it working? The moment that question gets asked, the autopilot shuts off. And without the autopilot, Erik's body had to handle the cold, the fatigue, and the search for a new strategy all at the same time. That was too much load to carry at once. Bruce was doing the exact opposite. His movement required no thought. Responses trained into his body over years were running on their own. When a threat came, the body had already moved before the brain finished processing. That was the core philosophy of Jeet Kune Do. Repeat the technique until the technique belongs to you. Until you can do it without thinking. Until the body and the mind are saying the same thing at the same moment. Bruce standing calmly in the cold wasn't luck. It was preparation. B. Jern Anderson, the Norwegian sports commentator sitting at ringside that day, wrote in his notes, "Lee isn't moving, but every strike is going exactly where he wants it to go. It's as if Erik isn't free, as if there's an invisible wire, and Bruce is the one holding it." Anderson didn't publish that note that day. It appeared years later in the foreword of a book about the match, but any spectator sitting in those stands was already carrying the same feeling. Erik gathered himself, the great advantage of a strength athlete is the ability to end everything in a single move. One clean hit and all the equations change. Erik knew that. He decided to load everything into one strike. Drive with the right shoulder, target Bruce's chest, take him to the ground, come down on top of him. Close the argument. He stepped forward, drew in one long, deep breath, and that breath was one of the most important breaths of Erik Halvorsen's life. Because that breath, even if he didn't consciously know it, was a declaration of commitment. When a man goes all in on a single move with no way back, the body pulls together whatever reserves it has left. Bruce saw that breath. He processed all of it in a single instant. The tension gathering in Erik's shoulders, the weight transferring forward, the angle of the right foot pressing into the ground. The breath, all of it together carrying one message. He's coming, and Bruce waited like a matador. That word wasn't chosen by accident. During that period, while studying movement and combat mechanics, Bruce had researched the footwork of Spanish bullfighters. The matador's art was the use of the bull's own power. The bull was massive, strong, lethal. The matador was small, fast, and precise. And the matador's most important weapon was the refusal to meet force with force, to step out of the space. The bull had filled with power, redirect the force just slightly, and watch the bull become the victim of its own momentum. Erik Halvorsen was the bull, with 265 pounds of momentum behind him. He launched forward. His hands were closing in on Bruce's chest. The distance was going to zero. The stands, which had been holding their collective breath this whole time, were about to let it go. Every prediction, every calculation, every claim made over the past 3 days, all of it was about to be proven right in this single moment. And, in that moment, Bruce Lee stepped one pace to the left. Erik's hands closed around nothing. A 265-pound body had lost its target and now had nowhere to go but forward. The surface was wet and cold. Erik lurched, a massive weight without a destination. His left foot slipped. His right foot tried to catch him, but the momentum was too great. His body pitched forward, hands reaching out for balance that wasn't there. Erik went down to one knee. Then his hands hit the ground. Then the other knee. The cold snow pressed into his palms. His face was inches from the floor of the ring. His breath, fast and ragged, came out in short white bursts. 48,000. People couldn't make a sound for one full second. They were in shock, trying to understand what they had just seen. Erik Halvorsen had never been in this position in his life. Hands on the ground, knees in the snow, breath scattered. Not once. Not ever. This wasn't just a physical situation. This was the moment 31. Years of a story, 31 years of an identity, 31 years of unshakable belief had started being quietly rewritten. Since the day that young boy on the Bergen waterfront had ignored the old fisherman's words, Erik had never felt this exposed, and now, in front of 48,000 people, with his hands in the snow, that exposure had come back. The stands exploded, but not the way you'd expect. This wasn't a victory roar for Norway's strongest man. It was shock. 10,000 people at once, confused and caught off guard, all making a sound that was less a cheer and more a question. Some had risen to their feet. Some were gripping the arms of whoever sat beside them. Somewhere in the crowd, someone had spilled their hot tea. Bruce Lee was simply standing there, exactly where he had been. He had stepped one pace to the left, held his balance, and dropped his arms to his sides. His breathing was still steady. His face carried no triumph, no anger, no pity. He was waiting, the way a doctor looks at a patient, the way a teacher looks at a student. Erik pressed his hands against the ground and pushed himself up. His body was exhausted in a way he was only now fully feeling. The cold snow against his palms was seeping inward. His muscles were dealing simultaneously with lactic acid, the cold, and the physical shock of the fall, but Erik got up. Slowly. Unsteadily, but he got up, and the instant he did, Bruce stepped forward, not running, not hurrying. 3 steps, and he was standing in front of Erik. He extended his hand. Extending a hand in the middle of a fight means different things in different moments. But Bruce's hand carried none of the performances or gestures that sometimes come with that act. It was offered quietly, plainly, sincerely, from one person to another. Erik looked at that hand. For a long moment, he just looked. 48,000 people were holding their breath. Because everyone understood whether Erik took that hand would determine the real outcome of this fight. The physical result had already been written. But the true result was being written right now, in this moment, in the space between those 2 men. Erik took Bruce's hand. And Bruce pulled him to his feet. A 265-pound man came off the ground, holding the hand of a 143-pound man. That image became the most widely printed photograph taken that day. Years later, it was used as a chapter heading in a book on Norwegian sports history under the title, Strength and Understanding. In the photo, you could see Erik's face. And on it was an expression the sports world rarely gets to see. Not performance. Not posture, respect, raw, pure, unguarded respect. Erik took 1 step back, found his footing, and looked at Bruce. He held that look for a long moment, then, in a voice strong and clear enough to carry over the full noise of the stadium, and in English, not Norwegian, because he felt that what he was about to say wasn't meant only for Norway, he spoke. You have the Valhalla spirit, he said. In Viking mythology, Valhalla was the hall where warriors went after dying in battle. But in this context, it meant something different. The spirit of Valhalla wasn't invincibility. It was the willingness to fight knowing you might lose. To keep moving forward even when you know your limits. To stand in front of the hardest thing you've ever faced without fear of what comes after. Erik had seen Bruce as a small actor, someone from a tropical climate, someone who would crumble in the cold, but what he was looking at now was something else entirely. He reached into his bag and pulled out something small. An ancient seal, a small rounded piece of stone from the Viking era, carved with Norse runic symbols. Erik had carried it for years. It had come from his grandfather, who had received it from his grandfather before him. In Viking tradition, it was the symbol one warrior gave to another as a sign of respect. Erik placed it in Bruce's palm. Bruce looked at it. He ran his finger slowly over the carved symbols. Then he raised his eyes to meet Erik's. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't smile. He just looked. And in that look, both men understood something that existed without words, without translation, without borders. 48,000 Norwegians rose to their feet. The applause shook the stadium. 6 months after that day, Erik Halvorsen gave an interview. It ran in Norway's largest sports magazine. The editor had chosen the iconic photo of Erik hoisting the Viking stone as the cover image. Erik looked at it and asked him to use a different one. The editor was surprised. Why? Erik was quiet for a moment before answering. Because that photo shows me at my strongest. But that wasn't when I was strongest. I was strongest when I was getting up off the ground, and I took Bruce's hand. The editor understood. He changed the photo. The most quoted passage from that interview was what Erik said about the cold. The journalist had asked, "You always describe the cold as your advantage. Was that day different?" Erik went quiet. Then he said, "I thought surviving. The cold was a physical thing. I trained outdoors for years. I got in the water in January. I thought I had beaten the cold. But that day I understood. Beating the cold and making peace with the cold are 2 different things. Bruce wasn't fighting the cold. He was existing. Alongside it, I was still fighting it. And the fight was costing me everything." That line became one of the most repeated quotes in Norwegian sports history. When Erik placed that seal in Bruce's palm, he didn't say another word. He didn't need to. That seal had passed from hand to hand through generations. It was what one warrior gave to another. And that day, He held it out to a 143-pound Chinese man, because the spirit of Valhalla had never been about size. It had never been about being undefeatable. It was about stepping into the ring knowing you might fall. About standing in front of the hardest thing you've ever faced without letting the fear of it change who you are. When Bruce Lee walked out that day, the crowd laughed. Nobody took him seriously. Nobody even considered for a moment that the outcome might be anything other than what it looked like on paper. And maybe at least once in your life, you've walked into a room like that one, a place where you weren't taken seriously, where you were underestimated before you even opened your mouth. So what did you do? How did you stand in that room? Share your story in the comments.